Hello YouTube, we are on the Real Programming channel. It is about HTML and CSS. My name is Andrei. This is our 74th lesson. I greet you, welcome. And we are talking about adding HTML structure for the table display. And let's start to how we are going to add structure to support the CSS table display using HTML. And first, we'll create a div that represents the entire table and nest the columns and rows within that div. Next, for each row in the table, we'll create another div that will contain the row content. For Starbucks, we have only one row. This is our row. And for each column, we just need a block element to act as that column. We already have two block column elements. We can use the main div and the sidebar div. Column, row, table, and sharpen your pencil and sheet of paper exercise. Now it's your turn. Go ahead and write the HTML you'll need for the table structure for Starbucks below. Write the HTML we'll need for the Starbucks table display layout in your sheet of paper. Exercise solution. Now it's a turn. Go ahead and write the HTML. Here is our answer. First, we'll wrap everything that's going to be displayed like a table and a div called table container. Then we'll create a div for the one row we need, and we'll call this div table row. Finally, each column for each we have existing divs main and sidebar will be displayed as a cell in the table. This is very simple table layout because it has only two cells, but you can get a lot more complex than this if you need to. And let's now write this in HTML. This is our HTML. We are not showing it, but the header up here. Add the new div with an ID container table container around the main and sidebar divs. Then I add the new div with an ID table row also around the main and sidebar divs, but nested inside the table container div. Make sure you properly nest your closing div text, and the footer is down here. Make sure you don't include the header and the footer in the new div. Now to use CSS to create table displays. Now that you know how to add the HTML structure to support the CSS table display, let's look at how we specify the CSS for each element to create the table display. First, we need to add the div for the table with the ID table container. And this div contains the row and columns. We start the table container div like this. And the table container is the outermost div and represents the entire table structure. Next, we added a div for the row with the ID table row. We have only one row with two cells, so we need just one div. If we had multiple rows, we need multiple divs. We style the row div like this. The table row div represents a row in the table. We have one row in our table, so we just need this one rule. If you have multiple rows, consider using a class instead, a div table row, so you can use one rule to style all the rows. Finally, we used our existing main and sidebar divs for the cells corresponding to each column in the row. We style these divs like this. The main and sidebar divs are the column in our table, so they each get displayed as a table cells. Main wheel, back at Starbus. It's time to add the table display into Starbus, so it's to see how those columns are going to look. To do that, we are going to roll back to the Starbus HTML and CSS we created at the beginning of the chapter, so open chapter 11. Table display to get fresh copies of the HTML and CSS, edit index.html, and add the two divs around both the main div and the sidebar div, the outer one called table container and the inner one called table row. Next, open your Starbus CSS file and let's add the following to the CSS. Refer back a couple of pages to see the HTML if you need to. The display table property tells the table container div that it will be laid out like a table, and the border spacing property adds table row 10 pixels of border spacing to the cells in this table. Think of border spacing like margin for regular elements, and because we're using border spacing on the cells, we no longer need the margins on the divs. See below. The table row div is the first and only row in our table. We can remove the margins on both main and the sidebar. Both the main div and the sidebar div are the cells in our table. Main is in the first column of the table row. Because it comes first in the HTML and sidebar is in the second column. And we need to add a property vertical elegant that makes sure all the content in both table cells is elegant to the top of the cell, as opposed to the middle or the bottom. A quick test drive. So, almost perfect. The only remaining issue is the extra space here. This is great. Our two columns look almost perfect. Try making the browser wider and then narrower. Notice that both columns are always equal in height, and we no longer have the problem with the column overlapping the footer. And we got our content in the correct order for mobile users. There's only one tiny little problem, which is easily fixed. Notice that the spacing between the header and the columns, as well as the footer and the columns, is just a bit too large. What's the problem with the spacing? We currently have a 10 pixels bottom margin on the header div and a 10 pixels top margin on the footer div. Before we added the table yacht, we were spacing the margins of both the main and sidebar div to have 0 pixels top margin. So the total margin between them and the header is 10 pixels and 10 pixels bottom margin. Now remember that the vertical margins block elements sitting next to each other collapse, meaning that even though we have 10 pixels of margin on the bottom of the columns and 10 pixels of margin on the top footer, this margin collapses into 10 pixels, so the total space between the columns and footer is also 10 pixels. When we remove the margins from the main and the sidebar divs, we created the 10 pixels of spacing using the border spacing property in the table container div instead. This adds 10 pixels of space between cells, as well as 10 pixels of space around the edges. But the space created by border spacing and the margin does not collapse. So we ended up with 20 pixels of space between the header and the columns, as well as 20 pixels of space between the columns and the footer. Fortunately, it's really easy to fix. We've got 10 pixels of border spacing at the top and bottom of the table and 10 pixels of margin on the header and footer. The margins don't collapse with the border spacing, so we've got 20 pixels of space where we want 10 pixels. Fix the spacing. To fix the spacing between the header and the columns and the footer and the columns, all we have to do is change the bottom margin of the header to be 0 pixels and the top margin of the footer to be 0 pixels. We currently specify all 4 sides of margin with the shortcut rule margin 10 pixels in the rules row for both the header and the footer. So instead, we'll expand the margin property to specify each side separately, so we can specify 10 pixels for all sides. And accept the one text to the columns like this. It's a header and this is a footer. Likewise, we now have 10 pixels margin on all sides of the footer except the top. Finally, test drive of our table display. We'll talk about this in the next lesson. This is our 74th lesson over. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel. Please put likes, share with friends, comment, eat bananas, chocolate and nuts, drink more water for the effective work of our brains. Bye.